Hello, and welcome once again to Friday Focus, where we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. Today, Friday Focus continues its look at the Psalms. We're looking at Psalm 105 today. Psalm 105, and I call it Remember. How's your memory? Right now, in my 83rd year, mine's actually pretty decent, though it sometimes fails me when I try to remember a name or a word or an event. At least, I'm not like the elderly couple who had guests over for dinner one evening. While both ladies were in the kitchen getting things ready, the two husbands sat chatting in the living room. The elderly host sat regaling his guest with stories of a fabulous restaurant they had visited earlier in the week. "It was the most amazing place I've ever been to," the host said. "What's it called?" his guest asked. The old gentleman began to answer, but he stumbled and bumbled as he tried to recall the name of the restaurant. It was, it was. His memory had vacated the premises. Finally, in desperation, he broke down and he asked his friends, he said, what do you call that flower that has all those pointy, prickly things on the stem? The other senior replied quickly, "Well, it's a rose." "Ah, yeah, that's it," his host said. And then he called out to his wife in the kitchen, "Rose, what's the name of that great restaurant we visited this week?" Well, my memory's not quite that bad. But we do need to remember and rehearse the good things God has done for us in the past. Why? Well, one source says this: remembering the good things from our past can be beneficial as it helps reinforce positive feelings and provides a sense of continuity in our lives. It can also improve health and well-being, strengthen trust and faith, and offer valuable lessons that shape who we are today. Well, that's as good a reason as any to recall God's goodness in your life. The writer of Psalm 105 understood that principle long before modern psychology ever did. In this psalm, he does something simple but powerful. He remembers what God has done, not just in some vague way, but in detail, walking through the history of God's people and reminding them how the Lord provided, protected, and kept his promises, even when circumstances looked impossible. That's something everyday people with everyday problems still need to do. So, as I read this psalm, I came up with 5 things to remember. 5 things to remember. The first one is remember who deserves the credit. The psalm begins with these words: "Give thanks to the Lord and proclaim his greatness. Let the whole world know what he has done." Psalm 105, verse 1. In other words, don't keep God's goodness to yourself. When something good happens, our natural tendency is to say things like, "Well, I worked hard," or "I got lucky," or "things just worked out." But this psalm reminds us that behind every blessing stands a faithful God. Think about your family, your home, the food on your table, the friends who encourage you, your job, and the prayers that have been answered. The psalmist says, talk about those things. Number 2, remember that God keeps his promises. A huge part of Psalm 105 focuses on God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God promised them a land and a future. However, reading their stories, you'll quickly notice something. Things did not happen overnight. There were delays, doubts, and times when the promise seemed impossible. To the person facing everyday struggles, That ought to be a great encouragement. Sometimes we pray and expect immediate answers, but God often works on a longer timeline than we do. And the answer may seem slow in coming, but this psalm reminds us that God doesn't forget his promises. What he begins, he finishes. All right, number 3 of the 5. Remember that hard times are not the end. We're also reminded of the story of Joseph. If anyone ever had a reason to think life had come apart, it was him. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, falsely accused, and then thrown into prison. Yet the psalm says Joseph was tested until the time came to fulfill his dreams. Did you get that? That's really important. In other words, the 13 years of trial and testing that Joseph endured weren't wasted. They were actually preparation. That's important as a lesson for anyone going through difficulty. It doesn't mean God's abandoned you. It may mean that he's preparing you. Difficult times are never pleasant, but God has a way of weaving even painful threads into a larger pattern. God has a plan, and he goes by it. All right, what's number 4? Simply this. Remember that God provides in impossible situations, and I have seen that when I wondered where money was going to come from, or where food was going to come from, or when I needed a new vehicle. God provided in what seemed like impossible situations. The psalmist recalls how God rescued his people from slavery in Egypt under Moses' leadership. There were plagues, miracles, dramatic events that forced Egypt to release them. But the story doesn't end there. Once the people left Egypt, they faced a new problem: survival in the wilderness. Now what? No farms, no grocery stores, no supply chains, just a desert wasteland. Yet, we're reminded that God provided food from heaven, water from a rock, guidance by cloud and fire. They were sustained for 40 years in a place where survival seemed impossible. There were hundreds of thousands of them, and they made it because God was faithful. In God's economy, circumstances aren't necessarily indicative of how things will work out. The God who provided in the wilderness still provides today, and often in quiet ways. Okay, what's the 5th thing? Well, it's this. Remember, so your faith stays strong. There's a reason the psalmist spends so much time remembering history, because forgetting leads to fear. When we forget what God has done, every new problem feels overwhelming. Remembering his faithfulness changes our perspective, like a memory album, if you like, of God's goodness. Looking back on those moments can strengthen our faith in the challenges we face today. And it's why Psalm 105 keeps repeating the theme of remembering, remembering, remembering. Every evening, take a moment to think of 3 things from your day for which you can thank God. They don't have to be dramatic. They can be simple. Perhaps a conversation with a friend, or a safe trip home, or strength to get through a difficult day, or what about a moment of unexpected joy? Over time, those memories become a record of God's care in your life. And if God has been faithful yesterday, there's every reason to trust him with today and tomorrow. This is Dr. Vic Holly, friend, in his grace. If you have any comments or questions, you can address them to me at vicsfridayfocus@gmail.com. That's vicsfridayfocus, all one word, @gmail.com. God bless you. Have a tremendous week, and don't forget to remember.